Well, 9 climate activists were arrested Tuesday for attempting to shut down all tar sands oil coming into the United States from Canada by manually turning off pipelines in Minnesota, Montana, North Dakota, and Washington state.
On October 11, 2016, Leonard Higgins and 4 other brave climate activists closed valves on the 5 pipelines carrying tar sands crude oil into the United States. Leonard, near Coal Banks Landing, Montana, cut the lock on a valve enclosure on Spectra Energy's Express pipeline and closed the valve. He then waited. Soon, Choteau County sheriffs arrived and he was arrested. Leonard and the others are facing felony charges with potential sentences of decades in prison and tens of thousands of dollars in fines.
I've lived a very conventional American dream kind of lifestyle. I married young, had several jobs throughout my career, bought the home, the cars. I've got 5 kids, 2 grandkids that I love dearly. And I figured I'd take care of my business in life. I'd look out for my family, do a few things in my church and my community, and, other folks would take care of the rest. I worked in large IT projects. We moved a lot of state services that people used to have to stand in line around the block at state offices onto the internet or by telephone, made those easier. And it was with a lot of dismay, upset, and finally desperation that I saw I couldn't count on government, state or federal level, to deal with the emergency of climate change. And in fact, that we, the public, weren't and still aren't being told about the true emergency that it presents. I took some classes at Portland State. I learned more about climate change. I learned what 97% of the Earth's scientists are saying that, and have been saying for several decades, that we're really at risk, not just at risk for being able to live the wonderful life that you're describing, but at risk in terms of extreme climate, droughts, crop failures. We see that happening in the more vulnerable parts of the world already. There was a large 350.org worldwide effort called Break Free to call attention to the climate emergency. And there were a couple of dozen or more locations all around the world where people planned and conducted break-free activities. In the Pacific Northwest, we did one in Anacortes called Break Free. And there's 2 large refineries there. We set up among probably 4 or 5 major activities that were a part of that Break Free event. We set up an oil train blockade and had perhaps 300 people on the tracks camped for 2 nights, 3 days, blocking a spur that carried crude oil from the main line into those 2 refineries.
Well, this is what I woke up to.
"52 of us were arrested, and through a course of a year and a half and maybe 12 trials, we really continued to have a conversation through the jurors and the judges with the community about the threat of climate change. And that culminated in a recent trial where the judge, as a part of sentencing, commended those of us that are willing to do civil disobedience in the tradition of our democracy. There's a quote from Zen that says that it's not civil disobedience that's the problem, it's obedience, civil obedience that's the problem. And we're really seeing that. We're seeing that unlike the history we have in our democracy of times when people's rights were run over, the rights that we all have constitutionally, when we have an obligation as citizens, when those are run over, to stand up for ourselves and for each other and for our children and our community, to insist on those rights. And this is one of those times. These large corporations that are trampling our rights, they're fouling the air with toxic chemicals in the areas where they're doing the extraction. It's harming the people that live there. As these chemicals are shipped across our country, they're harming communities and endangering communities where they go through. This is something that, as individuals and as communities, if we don't stand up to, it's not going to stop. And so several of us got together after that Break Free event in Anacortes and talked about two things. We talked about, number one, what's the fact set? What's the kind of action that would best fit the criteria for a necessity defense? And then the second is, how could we somehow break into mainstream media? It was during the presidential campaign cycle, and nobody was and is talking about climate change at the level of public discourse that's needed. And we decided that tar sands oil and coal, being the worst emitters of carbon, were our best target and our best way of communicating what needs to be done right away. So two aspects of that. One, that it's existing flow and infrastructure. It's not trying to stop something new, because we do need to start rolling back yesterday just what we're consuming and the carbon we're emitting every day. And the other is that the coal and oil are coal and tar sands oil are the dirtiest emitters. And so we began to research. We did several months of scouting in terms of online and actually tracing the routes of the pipeline, driving along them, and they don't run necessarily parallel with the road. We had a couple of objectives. One was to be able to identify the actual emergency block valve sites that were best to be able to get to and close in a way that we could do safely and publicly, and to see how we could address the risks of causing any kind of accident. And so as we researched that, we realized that using the company's safety protocols, we really could close down the pipeline just with telephone calls. And so really going to the block valve sites and closing the valves was a part of the theater that we developed in the action to try to make it most captivating and compelling as a story in getting out about what this country needs to do in ramping back on the use of fossil fuels. We made two calls to the pipeline companies. We made one call from a communications center in Seattle and let them know that in about 15 minutes we were going to be closing the valve, and ask them to shut the pipeline down according to their safety protocol. And then we made another call from on site in each location from a person that was set to live stream it. One of the concerns we had is we didn't want the pipeline company to think that it was a hoax. We wanted to be able to give them a website where they could go and actually see us prepared to shut down the valve and be able to identify the block valve site where we were at. I very clearly remember coming to the front gate of the enclosure and having these almost 4-foot long bolt cutters, and we'd practiced cutting chains. It turned out that unlike in Washington or North Dakota, where the chains really weren't ones that would really even keep your bicycle from getting stolen, they'd bought a little better chain in Montana, case-hardened steel, and it really took some heft. And I really didn't have any kind of sobering moment about a consideration of actually going forward and breaking the law. That decision and the acceptance of the risk and consequences of that decision were already behind me. And so at that point, it was strictly a matter of getting that chain cut, getting in and closing the valve. We'd notified the pipeline company and the flow of oil had already stopped. So I was preparing for the Chouteau County Sheriff deputies to show up, and me having completed my part of the action. And it was a real sense of relief once I got the valve closed, and a lot of peace, both in terms of being successful in what we set out to do, because I'd gotten word from the other sites that it had gone well, and in feeling like together we'd done something that had some chance of communicating the emergency that we're in and getting some response that's commensurate with that threat. So in the planning, as well as focusing on the safety aspects of it, we also talked about how it could be most effective. And so we really weren't planning a one-day action. We knew that because we were just closing valves and doing it in cooperation with the pipeline companies shutting down the pumping stations, that it would likely only remain closed for a number of hours. We understood that even though we could stop the flow temporarily, it was mainly a symbolic action of what we need to do. What we then counted on was leveraging what we'd done, the story of what we'd done, for a year or more of action leading up to trials where we could present the necessity defense and talk about why it applies in this case, where it's a lesser harm to break the law to shut down the pipeline than the threat we all face. It's similar to rescuing children out of a burning house. Nobody thinks about the breaking the law in terms of breaking and entering into the house, because it's clear what you're doing is rescuing those children. Even though they've been denied up to now, the last trial that'll come up on the schedules in Minnesota, they've been granted the ability to use a necessity defense by the judge in that trial. What this does is bring the courts into the whole dilemma of what to do about the threat we face. The checks and balances in our system include having three branches of government, with the judicial, the courts being one of them. And one of the important things about that system are juries, that these are a jury of our peers, people from our community that come in and decide based on the evidence presented in court whether we're guilty or not. And the necessity defense is sometimes called the lesser harm defense. It's in a case where there's a harm happening, and I mentioned the children caught in the house on fire. Civil disobedience focuses on unjust laws. And what we're focused on is the continued permitting of harm by the federal and state government, by the fossil fuel companies. It's clear that we need to cut back on the emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. Exxon themselves, their scientists, knew in the late 70s, early 80s, that we needed to get away from the burning of fossil fuels. Our own federal government, there are documents going back to the late 70s recognizing the threat of carbon emissions and the eventual need to avoid putting the carbon in the atmosphere because of eventual climate change. And we're at that point. We're decades down the road. And not only has the federal government not protected our constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property. None of us can have those things without a stable climate. But they've actually been complicit. They have followed energy policies, they've done subsidies, they've failed to control this harmful activity, these companies. That's not just. And so my intent in cutting those chains, in closing that valve, was not trespassing, was not criminal mischief. It was to exercise my First Amendment rights to draw attention to the emergency. If I am convicted, we'll be appealing to the Montana Supreme Court on the basis of not being allowed the necessity defense. We're doing everything we can to get word of the emergency out in the public, where there's a lot of leverage for people to respond. Collectively, we, the people, have the true power in this country if we're willing to take it, and our courts as a last resort to respond to the emergency. From my attorney's standpoint, the best outcome would be me being found innocent on both charges. And while I agree that's a great outcome, I really don't want to go to prison. I'm prepared to, but I don't want to. Really, when I look at what are the metrics of success, it's being effective in getting the word out about the emergency and the threat we face, and getting out as broadly as possible, and having the most chance of a court reaction and a public reaction that really starts bringing us down the road doing the things we need to do to avert catastrophe.